Greetings, law and policy students. Thank you all so much for your spirited discussion of the topics covered in this module. College completion is the last of the three prongs, if you will, of state and federal policy that we are examining before we move on to specific state-level case studies that will provide some examples of what we've been talking about in practice, while highlighting different policy and political frameworks as they affect post-secondary education in different parts of the U.S. If the PPHE textbook had a fourth prong of policy or interest of policymakers, it would likely be the success of college graduates. As you perhaps know, there are more and more conversations in North Carolina and across the country about preparing students for jobs, and it's a conversation that's really, I think, altering the purpose and structure of higher education. Here at UNCW, it's likely that such a focus will be a top priority of our new Chancellor, Dr. Chardarelli. At a 30,000-foot level, think of all that our systems of education are responsible for, or supposed to be responsible for. Basic education and preparation for post-secondary education, including the skills needed to graduate high school and then be successful in some form of college or post-secondary education. Fill in the skills gaps for college success, needed for college success through remedial or supplemental instruction. Facilitate transfer to an appropriate institution if the initial college, either a community college stepping stone to a four-year degree, or the student is somehow dissatisfied with their initial college choice and perhaps one of those mobile students that Sarah discussed in her presentation. Provide a high-quality education while keeping college affordable, and prepare students for the workforce and career success. And that's just the basics, not to mention the services and experiences provided to students in between. The passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, was a giant leap forward in providing broader access to higher education, followed 21 years later by the passage of the Higher Education Act of 1965, which included what would become our current federal grant and aid programs. Literature on the history and organization of higher education, where the individual, literature on the history and organization of higher education discusses the resulting massification of higher education, where the individual student experience became one of receiving education in a mass production format. We're still under that pressure today, folks, and the biggest cash cows are master's programs, but I digress. An under-considered element of these programs that expanded access and also expanded the numbers of students participating in higher education, as well as the rapid expansion in K-12 education at the start of the 20th century, was the process of delivering education to increasingly larger numbers of people without always considering individual differences among learners and learning styles. For the longest time, we operated under the assumption that everyone pretty much learned the same way. In the discussion board on remediation, Adam asked, and several of you commented, on the faulty cookie-cutter approach to education, that we now know and have evidence to demonstrate that people do in fact learn differently. So why do we continue to operate in this massified mass production approach? Cost efficiencies. Cost efficiencies and the need to keep costs down creates the tension here, and it seems to me that in remediation, college preparation, and success, we're reaping the whirlwind of these mass production approaches to education. If we can identify cost-efficient, individualized, or small group approaches, we might be in business. And you can read lots into my use of the word business. Adam indicated the age of the Merisotis and Phillips reading. While it was published in 2000, the issues of remediation 15 years ago are still with us today. Readiness gaps persist. Remediation still costs colleges and students a lot of money for something that doesn't get them ready for graduation. These programs eat up student aid money. Legislators hate the costs. They hate that we spend money on these programs. And educators and legislators both finger point back and forth, blaming high schools for not doing their jobs. I appreciate what Missy added about the connection of remediation to proficiency or competency-based approaches to education. I'm always going to believe that someone needs to demonstrate to me that they can write in a somewhat formal manner, but certainly there are ways to demonstrate skills without subjecting students to standardized tests, shaming them, or taking their money for something that they should have learned in high school. And there I go, finger pointing. I don't agree with the idea of limiting education to the community college. I was awful at math and nearly failed calculus my freshman year of college. Perhaps that's not truly remedial. Again, it's in the eye of the beholder, but I needed more help than what was available at the time at William & Mary. And I name drop the college because it supports the point made by many of you that no student at all of our institutions or any of our institutions is necessarily proficient in all that they need to know. I also happen to believe, like Leah, that we need to instill more than academic skills in students, or perhaps more than academic proficiency or competency in students. Many students in remedial education, sorry about the shift, are likely to benefit from study skills, time management skills, and a souped-up version, perhaps, of a first-year orientation seminar. I appreciated Sarah's presentation on Hostler and Friends' chapter on longitudinal approaches to persistence and retention. There's a lot of good stuff in this article and Sarah's presentation, starting with the basic distinctions between persistence and retention, were very, very helpful, and I hope that you paid attention to that in the piece and in Sarah's presentation. What Sarah and the authors discuss are these mobile students who may move from one institution to the next based on a number of factors, from dissatisfaction to performance to convenience to the desire to transfer to a different degree or degree program or institution. And I tend to consider this phenomenon primarily in the context of community college, of the community college literature, where we tend to use the term swirling, where students swirl between institutions, often because of convenience, but sometimes to shop for better or more convenient courses and course times. This sort of mobility is a growing concern for four-year institutions. And a good example of this, those of you who work in the UNC system, in the community college system, perhaps are aware that the UNC system has recently permitted students to shop for online courses across the system to fulfill comparable requirements at their home institutions. And we had several inquiries this summer about our UNCW higher education courses from students from UNC Greensboro and elsewhere. Thank goodness we're part of a state system where course credits and descriptions have been negotiated statewide to the point that our institutions can talk to each other and we can keep track of such mobility. As Sarah pointed out, student mobility in post-secondary education creates problems of metrics, data sharing, and educating policymakers and politicians about the realities for these students and of working with these students, and how this behavior makes our traditional measures of college success, such as retention and graduation rates, far less reliable if ever they were good measures of success to begin with. I'm sorry we lost our presentation on performance-based funding, but the topic brings me full circle to my discussion of the many and complicated responsibilities of our educational system, and the constraints that publicly funded education faces in fulfilling those responsibilities. Like several other topics that we've discussed, performance-based funding is not a terribly new concept. In its current iteration, in some parts, it seems to be a confluence of shifting policies that favor market-based approaches to education, the recession which saps state coffers of tax money, and a belief in the power of big data and more data for the purpose of making decisions for education. As a quantitative researcher, primarily, and this is a little bit of a soapbox moment, I can tell you that one of the biggest challenges to relying solely on numeric inputs to measure performance is that even our best data models of human behavior typically can only explain about half of the variance, or, in other words, half of the phenomenon we're attempting to measure. I believe in accountability. I believe that we need to be evaluated on our performance, but I think as many of you have indicated in your conversations this module and previously in the course, context, individual experiences, and really the availability and flexibility of resources also matter a great deal in our ability to perform well as institutions of post-secondary education. I will close this update with props to, and I'm having a little bit of a computer issue here, sorry about that. Come on, there we go, we're back. I'll close this update with some props to Jason, who seems like he's starting to put all of what we've been reading and talking about together in a package that I thought was pretty interesting and pretty compelling. In response to Adam's video on remediation, Jason noted the potential benefits of sequencing together guaranteed aid to prompt the college-going conversation and encourage college readiness, along with classroom approaches that prepare the student for college and to meet admission requirements for the institution of choice, including addressing performance gaps that might come up and be subject to remediation. I like this thinking, but I encourage all of you who are thinking in terms of individual students, which is very much, I think, how we were socialized, particularly if you came up like me through the student affairs ranks. If you're thinking primarily about what works well for the individual student, I urge you to also think in terms of scalability. Scalability of interventions rather to an institutional scale, to a state scale, or even to a national level. That's where lowercase p policy that we might have in place on a specific campus or even a statewide system for students meets capital P policy at the broader levels. And we have to have that confidence and that ability for those to work together, to work at bigger and broader levels in some ways in order to affect policy change and to make policy work. And of course, it's a back and forth. You don't just have an intervention necessarily, sometimes always without a policy, and policy sometimes gets made, though it shouldn't, without the benefit of knowing if a specific intervention might necessarily work. So there has to be this sort of two-way communication and consideration of this process kind of at a two-way back and forth between the capital P and the lowercase p. At any rate, that's my update for the current module, and I look forward to seeing you in Module 5. Take care.